Picture this. You're a Japanese Zero pilot over Rabaul, early 1944. The morning sun glints off your cockpit as you climb through 10,000 feet, confident in your machine's legendary agility. You've trained for years to master this aircraft. You've watched American Wildcats struggle to keep up. You've seen P-38 seconds forced to rely on their twin engines just to match your climb rate. Then you spot them. A formation of strange new American fighters, their wings bent in an unnatural gull shape, each one hauling what looks like a massive fuel tank beneath its belly. You smile. Heavily loaded enemy planes. Easy prey. You push your stick forward, preparing to dive and strike, but something impossible happens. The lead American fighter doesn't run. Instead, it angles upward, drop tanks still attached, and begins climbing. Not struggling, not laboring, climbing fast, faster than you. You push your throttle to the firewall, urging every ounce of power from your sake engine. Your Zero, the fighter that could outclimb anything America had thrown into the Pacific for 2 years, suddenly feels inadequate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American plane keeps rising, pulling away from you effortlessly, its massive engine roaring a sound you'll never forget. 4,000 feet per minute. That's what the Corsair could do, even with external tanks. Your Zero, at its absolute best, managed 3,100. In that moment, watching the bent-wing fighter disappear into the sun above you, you realize something terrifying. The rules have changed. America has brought a new kind of power to the Pacific skies, and nothing in your training prepared you for this. The Vought F-4U Corsair wasn't just another fighter. It was proof that American engineering had solved a problem Japanese designers never thought needed solving. How do you make a fighter that climbs like a rocket, carries extra fuel for range, fights like a demon, and still brings its pilot home through a wall of anti-aircraft fire? The answer sat in that massive Pratt & Whitney engine, and by the time Japanese pilots understood what they were facing, it was already too late. Before the Corsair arrived, Japan's aviators had grown comfortable. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, when Zeros tore through American formations over Hawaii and the Philippines, Allied pilots quickly learned a brutal lesson. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange virtually everything in the American inventory. Its climb rate of over 3,000 feet per minute was exceptional for its time. The Nakajima Sakai engine, while producing only around 950 horsepower, drove a lightweight airframe that weighed barely 5,600 pounds when loaded. This combination gave Zero pilots a critical advantage. Altitude was life in air combat. Whoever controlled the high ground could choose when and how to fight. For nearly 2 years, that high ground belonged to Japan. American pilots in Brewster Buffaloes and early Grumman Wildcats found themselves consistently outclimbed, forced to fight on Japanese terms or die trying. Even the nimble P-40 Warhawks that defended China could barely match a Zero's climbing performance. Japanese training emphasized this advantage relentlessly. The Zero's design philosophy reflected Japan's strategic needs perfectly. It needed range to escort bombers across vast Pacific distances. It needed agility to defeat enemy fighters in turning combat. And it needed to climb quickly to intercept incoming raids. To achieve this, designers at Mitsubishi made calculated trade-offs. The Zero carried no armor plating. Its fuel tanks lacked self-sealing protection. The airframe used thin aluminum that saved weight, but offered no protection against enemy fire. These choices meant experienced pilots could wring remarkable performance from the Zero. In the hands of veterans who had honed their skills over China, the Zero seemed unstoppable. Reports from early Pacific battles showed kill ratios as high as 12-1 in Japan's favor. American intelligence officers struggled to understand how Japan had produced such a dominant fighter. Some refused to believe it was entirely Japanese designed, spreading rumors that it must have been copied from captured American plans. This was pure prejudice. The Zero was entirely Japanese, and it was brilliant within its specific design parameters. But those same parameters carried a fatal flaw. The Zero's light construction and minimal protection meant it couldn't evolve easily. Adding armor meant adding weight, which killed climb rate and maneuverability. Installing more powerful engines required stronger airframes, more fuel, better cooling systems. Each upgrade cascaded into more problems. As the war dragged on, Japan's industrial capacity couldn't keep pace with American innovation. While US factories churned out new fighter models every year, each one better than the last, Japanese designers found themselves stuck. Attempts to replace the Zero repeatedly failed or arrived too late. Meanwhile, American pilots were learning. After the shock of Pearl Harbor wore off, tactical innovations emerged. The Thach Weave, developed by Navy Commander John Thach, used teamwork to negate the Zero's turning advantage. Instead of dogfighting individually, American pilots flew in pairs, covering each other and using superior firepower to compensate for inferior agility. But tactics could only go so far. What the Pacific Campaign really needed was better hardware. In early 1942, Republic Aviation was already testing a fighter that would eventually become the P-47 Thunderbolt. Grumman was refining the design that would become the F-6F Hellcat, and Chance Vogt was pushing forward with something unprecedented, a carrier fighter built around the most powerful engine then available. Each of these aircraft represented a completely different philosophy from the Zero's lightweight approach. They prioritized pilot protection, rugged construction, overwhelming firepower, and, most critically, raw power. The Corsair embodied this philosophy more than any other American fighter. Where the Zero's Sakai engine produced less than 1,000 horsepower, the Corsair's Pratt & Whitney R 2,800 double Wasp generated over 2,000. That's more than double the power driving an airframe that, while heavier, was built to handle punishment. The Zero was a rapier. The Corsair was a sledgehammer wrapped in steel plate. By 1943, as the first Corsairs began arriving in the South Pacific, Japanese intelligence started receiving troubling reports. A new American fighter with bent wings was appearing over the Solomons. It was fast, brutally fast in straight-line speed. It could dive away from Zeros without fear. And most concerning, it seemed to climb remarkably well for such a large aircraft. Initial encounters were scattered. A few Corsairs here and there, mixed in with Wildcats and P-38 seconds. Japanese pilots who tangled with them came back shaken but unable to provide clear details. The plane looked ungainly with its inverted gull wings and long nose. Surely it couldn't be as dangerous as the scattered reports suggested. Then came February 1943. Marine Squadron VMF 124 deployed to Guadalcanal with a full complement of Corsairs. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, they flew their first major combat mission, escorting B-24 Liberators against the Japanese airfield at Kahili. The Japanese scrambled Zeros to intercept. What followed shocked both sides. The Americans lost 2 Corsairs, 4 P-38 seconds, and 2 P-40 seconds in a chaotic dogfight. The Japanese lost multiple aircraft as well. But the Americans learned something vital that day. The Corsair, even in the hands of pilots still learning its quirks, was fundamentally different from anything they'd flown before. It could absorb punishment that would have shredded a Wildcat. It could outrun Zeros in level flight and in dives, and most surprisingly, despite its size and weight, it could climb aggressively when pilots used its power correctly. Those early lessons spread quickly. Marine aviators began developing tactics specifically for the Corsair. Don't try to turn fighter Zero, that was suicide. Instead, use speed and altitude. Climb above the enemy, dive through their formation, guns blazing, then use that massive engine to climb back up before they could react. This boom and zoom approach played perfectly to the Corsair's strengths and negated the Zero's advantages. But there was still a problem. The early Corsair's operational range, while decent, wasn't enough for the vast distances of the Pacific Campaign. Pilots needed to escort bombers deep into enemy territory or conduct fighter sweeps far from friendly bases. The solution was external fuel tanks, drop tanks that could be jettisoned when entering combat. Every fighter used them. The difference was how they affected performance. On a Zero, Adding a drop tank meant a noticeable degradation in climb rate and maneuverability. The extra weight and drag slowed the aircraft enough that pilots felt vulnerable until they could drop the tank and fight clean. This was acceptable because Japanese doctrine assumed they'd have warning of enemy approach. Ground controllers or scout planes would spot incoming raids early, giving Zeros time to climb to altitude, drop their tanks, and prepare for combat. But American planners had a different vision. They wanted Corsair pilots to be able to fight effectively, even with tanks attached. If a patrol ran into unexpected trouble, pilots needed the option to engage immediately rather than fleeing to drop tanks first. This seemed like an impossible ask. How could a fighter loaded with external fuel possibly outclimb enemy interceptors? The answer lay in that monstrous R2800 engine and the Corsair's fundamental design. The Corsair's structure was immensely strong. Its inverted gull wing, while visually distinctive, served a practical purpose. It allowed the landing gear to be shorter and sturdier, while still providing clearance for the massive 13-foot propeller. That design also created optimal angles for the wing's connection to the fuselage, reducing drag. The whole airframe was engineered to handle stress, thick skin, reinforced spars. Every component built to withstand the violence of carrier landings and combat damage. This robustness meant the Corsair could carry external stores without falling apart. Most fighters of the era couldn't safely carry more than a small drop tank or a single bomb. The Corsair could haul 200-gallon drop tanks under its wings or a massive centerline tank plus bombs and rockets. And thanks to that R2800 engine screaming at over 2,000 horsepower, it could still perform. The power-to-weight ratio, even when loaded, remained competitive. This was the secret Japanese pilots couldn't grasp until they experienced it firsthand. Development of the Corsair's drop tank system progressed through 1943 and into 1944. Early models used simple metal tanks that added significant drag. Engineers refined the designs, creating streamlined aluminum tanks that mounted cleanly under the wings on sturdy pylons. The F4U-1D variant, which entered service in April 1944, featured improved bomb and fuel tank mounting points, specifically designed for heavy loads. By late 1944, when the F4U-4 model arrived, the Corsair had evolved into something truly formidable. The new variant used an upgraded R280018W engine with water injection that could produce 2,450 horsepower under combat emergency power. A four-bladed propeller replaced the original three-bladed design, translating that power more efficiently into thrust. The result was staggering. The F4U-4's rate of climb exceeded 4,300 feet per minute at sea level when flying clean. Even with external fuel tanks attached, it could still manage close to 4,000 feet per minute in the initial climb. Compare that to the Zero. The A6M5 model, which represented Japan's attempt to upgrade the Zero line, used an improved Sakae engine that pushed power to 1,130 horsepower. Its climb rate remained around 3,100 feet per minute at best, and that was only when flying clean with no external stores. Add a drop tank, and performance degraded noticeably. Japanese pilots flying the A6M5 in late 1944 faced an impossible situation. They were flying an aircraft that was fundamentally outclassed in almost every measurable way. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Imagine being a Japanese pilot in 1944. You've been told the Zero is the finest carrier fighter in the world. You've trained extensively in its use. You understand its strengths and how to exploit them. Your entire tactical doctrine revolves around outclimbing opponents, seizing altitude advantage, and using superior agility to dictate combat terms. Then an American Corsair appears below you. You're at 12,000 feet. It's at 8,000. Perfect setup for a diving attack. You roll inverted and pull through, building speed as you descend toward your target. But the American pilot sees you coming. Instead of running or turning to defend, he pushes his throttle forward and pulls into a climbing turn. You're already committed to your dive. You flash past below him, hoping to extend away and reset. But when you pull out and look back, he's not following at your altitude. He's above you. Somehow, in the time it took you to dive and extend, he climbed 4,000 feet, with drop tanks still attached. Your mind races. This shouldn't be possible. Your intelligence briefings said nothing about American fighters that could outclimb a Zero while carrying external fuel. You try to climb after him, but your engine is already straining. He's gaining altitude faster than you can match. Within minutes, he's 5,000 feet above you, and you're entirely at his mercy. This scenario played out repeatedly over places like Rabaul, Truk, and later the Philippines. Japanese pilots who survived these encounters returned to base confused and demoralized. Some submitted reports questioning whether the Corsairs they'd fought were somehow modified or using special engines. Others simply stopped trying to engage Corsairs in climbing fights, ceding altitude advantage before combat even began. The loss of that psychological edge, the certainty that your fighter could always outclimb the enemy, was devastating. Japanese commanders recognized the problem, but had no solution. Their industry couldn't produce more powerful engines quickly enough. Attempts to develop replacement fighters like the Kawanishi N-1K or the Mitsubishi J-2M faced delays and production difficulties. The Zero, which was supposed to be a stopgap until better aircraft arrived, remained in frontline service throughout the war. Each month that passed saw its relative performance decline further as American fighters continued improving. By early 1945, the situation had become catastrophic. The F-4U-4 was now standard equipment in Marine and Navy squadrons. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, while not quite as fast or powerful as the Corsair, also boasted superior climb rates and could carry heavy fuel loads without excessive performance penalty. Japanese pilots flying Zeros found themselves in aircraft that were slower, climbed worse, carried less ammunition, and offered no protection. The only advantage remaining was low-speed maneuverability, but American pilots had learned to avoid turning dogfights entirely. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of Pacific air warfare. They'd created fighters that could carry enough fuel to reach deep into enemy territory while retaining enough performance to dominate any combat that occurred. Japanese fighters couldn't match this combination. Zeros could go the distance but arrived too weak to fight effectively against fresh American opposition. This imbalance sealed Japan's fate in the air war. The Corsairs' ability to climb at 4,000 feet per minute while carrying drop tanks wasn't just an impressive technical achievement. It was a strategic weapon that invalidated Japanese tactical doctrine. Every assumption Japanese planners had made about fighter combat had to be reconsidered, and by the time they understood the problem, it was far too late to address it. What made this defeat particularly bitter was that Japanese engineers knew exactly what needed to be done. They needed more powerful engines, they needed stronger airframes, they needed self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection. But Japan's industrial capacity, already strained by years of war and increasingly cut off from raw materials by American submarine blockades, simply couldn't deliver. Factories that should have been producing advanced fighters were stuck building Zeros because retooling would cost precious production time. The consequences rippled through Japan's entire defensive strategy. By mid-1945, when the fight moved to Okinawa and the approaches to the home islands, Japanese air power had effectively ceased to exist as a conventional force. Zeros still flew, but mostly as kamikaze aircraft. The idea of meeting American fighters in equal combat had become fantasy. Corsairs and Hellcats roamed freely, shooting down anything that rose to challenge them and strafing ground targets with impunity. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The F-4U-4 Corsair weighed around 14,000 pounds, fully loaded with fuel and ammunition. Its R280018W engine produced up to 2,450 horsepower. Maximum speed exceeded 448 miles per hour at 26,000 feet. Service ceiling reached 41,000 feet. With drop tanks, range extended to over 1,500 miles. Rate of climb, even with external tanks attached, hovered around 3,800 to 4,000 feet per minute, depending on configuration and pilot technique. The A6M50 weighed just over 6,300 pounds loaded. Its Sakae engine managed 1,130 horsepower at best. Maximum speed topped out around 350 miles per hour. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Service ceiling reached 33,000 feet. Range with drop tank approached 2,000 miles, the Zero's one remaining advantage. But rate of climb, the critical stat for Pacific combat, maxed out around 3,100 feet per minute, when clean, and dropped significantly with external stores attached. These numbers meant life or death. A Corsair pilot could dictate every aspect of a fight. He could choose to engage or decline combat based on tactical considerations rather than aircraft limitations. A Zero pilot no longer had that luxury. His only option when facing Corsairs was to run and hope they didn't chase, or accept combat on completely unfavorable terms. The battles over Rabaul in late 1943 and early 1944 perfectly illustrated this shift. Rabaul, located on the northern tip of New Britain Island, served as Japan's primary air and naval base in the South Pacific. Hundreds of aircraft were stationed there, including numerous Zero squadrons tasked with defending the base and attacking Allied positions. When Corsairs arrived in theater, Japanese commanders expected to handle them the same way they'd handled previous American fighters. They were catastrophically wrong. The first major test came on November 11, 1943. Navy Squadron VF-17, the famous Jolly Rogers, flew Corsairs in support of carrier strikes against Rabaul. The mission required the Corsairs to escort strike aircraft deep into heavily defended airspace. Japanese Zeros rose to meet them, confident in their numerical advantage and home field position. What followed stunned the defenders. The Corsairs, flying with external fuel tanks to extend their range, didn't retreat when Zeros approached at altitude. Instead, they jettisoned their tanks and dove into combat, using their superior speed to slash through Japanese formations. When Zeros tried to climb after them, the Corsairs simply pulled away, climbing faster despite having just burned fuel in high-speed maneuvers. The engagement ended with multiple Japanese aircraft downed and all Corsairs returning to their carriers. Japanese after-action reports from Rabaul showed confusion and concern. Pilots reported that the new American fighters seemed immune to standard Zero tactics. Trying to outclimb them failed. Trying to outdive them was suicidal, as the Corsair was faster in a dive. The only option was to try to force a turning dogfight, but the Americans refused to play that game. They would make one pass, guns blazing, then extend away or climb before Zeros could retaliate. If the Zeros gave chase, they'd find themselves consistently outpaced and outclimbed, eventually running low on fuel and forced to break off. One Japanese pilot stationed at Rabaul later described his experience in an interrogation report. He explained that before the Corsairs arrived, defending against American raids followed a predictable pattern. Zeros would climb to altitude, spot incoming bombers and their fighter escort, then use their superior climb rate to position above the formation. They'd dive through the escorts, scatter them, then swing around to attack the bombers. This worked well against P-40 seconds and even against the twin-engine P-38 seconds to some extent. But against Corsairs, this tactic failed spectacularly. The Corsairs wouldn't scatter. They'd absorb the initial diving pass, their rugged construction, shrugging off hits that would have destroyed Zeros. Then they'd turn the tables, using their power to climb back up and attack the Zeros from above. Within weeks, Rabaul's defenders stopped trying to gain altitude advantage over Corsair formations. By early 1944, the pattern was clear. In every engagement where Corsairs faced Zeros, the Americans dictated terms. They chose when to fight and when to disengage. Japanese pilots found themselves reacting rather than controlling battles. This reversal of initiative had profound effects on morale. Pilots who dominated the skies for years suddenly felt hunted. The psychological weight of knowing every American fighter above you could climb faster than you, while carrying extra fuel, was crushing. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, flew with Marine squadrons in the Pacific as a civilian technical advisor during 1944. His mission was to help pilots maximize the Corsairs' combat effectiveness and payload capacity. In the Marshall Islands, Lindbergh demonstrated that a Corsair could carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs, far exceeding official specifications. But more importantly, he worked with pilots to develop techniques for extending range, using careful fuel management and external tanks. His findings showed that Corsairs could fly strikes hundreds of miles from base, fight over the target area, and return with fuel to spare. This capability meant American commanders could project air power across vast ocean expanses that had previously been unreachable. Japanese planners watched helplessly as their defensive perimeter shrank. Islands they'd fortified became isolated when Corsairs and other long-range American fighters swept away defensive air cover. Supply convoys couldn't move safely because Corsairs could range far enough to intercept them. Even bases that should have been out of reach found themselves under attack. The combination of range, firepower, and performance, particularly that incredible climb rate, even with external tanks, made the Corsair into a strategic asset rather than just a tactical fighter. The Philippines campaign in late 1944 showcased this evolution. When General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines in October, Japanese forces attempted to defend the islands with everything they had. This included several air groups equipped with Zeros, tasked with attacking American landing forces and protecting Japanese ground units. Marine Corsair squadrons swept ahead of the invasion fleet, establishing air superiority. The Japanese tried desperately to contest control of the skies. Zero after Zero rose to meet American formations. Most never came back. One particularly telling engagement occurred over Leyte Gulf during the massive naval battle in October 1944. Corsairs flying combat air patrol over the invasion beaches spotted incoming Japanese attack formations. The Japanese aircraft, a mix of Zeros and bombers, approached at medium altitude. Standard Zero doctrine would have been to climb above the defenders, gain positional advantage, then strike. But the Corsairs were already there, at 20,000 feet, waiting. When the Japanese formation came into range, the Corsairs dove. By the time the Zeros reacted and tried to climb to engage the diving Americans, it was too late. The Corsairs flashed through the formation, scattered it, then used their superior climb rate to regain altitude before the Zeros could pursue. The bombers, left unprotected, were picked apart by anti-aircraft fire and additional Corsair passes. The entire Japanese strike failed to inflict significant damage. Reports from Japanese survivors of such engagements reveal a recurring theme. They describe feeling helpless against American aircraft that seemed to violate the known laws of fighter combat. How could planes carrying external tanks climb faster than a clean Zero? How could they dive away, then return, to the fight at even higher altitude? Japanese pilots had been taught that altitude equaled energy, and energy equaled control. But Americans were somehow generating energy from that massive engine faster than gravity could give it to a diving Zero. This broke the fundamental framework of Japanese fighter doctrine. By 1945, the situation grew even more desperate. The F-4U-4, with its four-bladed propeller and water injection-boosted engine, began entering service in significant numbers. This variant represented the pinnacle of Corsair development during World War II. Its performance exceeded anything Japan could field. Stories from the Okinawa campaign describe Japanese pilots refusing to engage Corsairs if they had any choice in the matter. The only time Zeros would attack was when they had overwhelming numerical superiority or when serving as kamikaze escorts, where survival wasn't expected anyway. The kamikaze tactic itself represented Japan's tacit admission of air combat defeat. When your air force can no longer contest enemy fighters in conventional combat, you resort to suicide attacks as weapons. Corsairs hunted kamikaze formations relentlessly. Their climb rate advantage meant they could intercept incoming suicide planes before they reached their targets. American carrier task forces kept Corsairs on station continuously, ready to scramble at moment's notice. When radar picked up incoming threats, Corsairs would launch, climb rapidly to intercept altitude, and massacre the kamikaze formations before they got close. The combination of radar direction, carrier-based deployment, superior climb performance, and overwhelming firepower created an almost impenetrable defensive screen. Japanese military records from the war's final months make grim reading. Training programs had collapsed under the strain of constant losses. New pilots received minimal instruction before being sent to frontline units. Many had less than 100 hours of total flight time. Some had barely soloed. These inexperienced aviators were expected to fly zeros against veteran American pilots in Corsairs. The resulting combats were massacres. American aces ran up kill scores that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. It wasn't unusual for a single Corsair pilot to shoot down multiple Japanese aircraft in a single mission. The technical reasons for this one-sided slaughter were clear. A trained pilot in a superior aircraft will nearly always defeat a novice in an inferior plane. But the Corsair's climb rate advantage added an additional dimension. Even when Japanese pilots tried to flee combat, they couldn't escape by climbing. The one evasion tactic that might have saved them, trading speed for altitude, didn't work. Corsairs would simply climb faster and catch them anyway. This left Japanese pilots with no way out. They couldn't win fights. They couldn't escape. All they could do was hope to damage the enemy before being shot down themselves. Interrogations of captured Japanese pilots and examination of recovered documents after the war revealed the psychological toll this took. Pilots described combat against Corsairs as hopeless. They knew before engaging that they would likely die. The Zero, which had once been a source of pride, became a death trap. Its lack of armor meant any hits were likely fatal. Its inability to climb away from danger meant you couldn't run even if you wanted to. Flying a Zero against Corsairs in 1945 was essentially a suicide mission, just slower than strapping a bomb to your plane and diving at a ship. The contrast between Japanese and American pilot experiences is stark. American Corsair pilots wrote home describing feelings of invincibility. They knew their aircraft could handle anything the Japanese threw at them. They trusted their planes to bring them back even after sustaining heavy damage. Maintenance crews kept Corsairs flying despite battle damage that would have grounded lesser aircraft. Multiple stories exist of Corsairs returning to base with entire sections of wing blown away, fuselages riddled with holes, yet still flying. That ruggedness gave pilots confidence to press attacks harder and take risks they never would have in earlier aircraft. Japanese pilots had no such confidence. They knew any hit might be fatal. They knew their aircraft couldn't match American performance. They knew rescue was unlikely if shot down over water. This knowledge affected everything from tactical decision-making to simple mental health. Depression and fatalism spread through Japanese air units as the war progressed. Some pilots volunteered for kamikaze missions rather than face the prolonged terror of conventional combat they knew they couldn't win. The irony is that the Zero hadn't become a bad aircraft overnight. In 1941 and 1942, in the hands of well-trained pilots, it dominated the Pacific skies. Its performance, while now eclipsed, was still respectable by earlier war standards. What changed wasn't so much that the Zero got worse, but that American aircraft got dramatically better while Japanese planes stagnated. The Corsair's 4,000 feet per minute climb rate with drop tanks wasn't just incrementally better than the Zero's performance. It was a generational leap that invalidated every tactical assumption Japanese air doctrine was built upon. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A Corsair squadron could take off from base carrying full internal fuel plus external drop tanks, fly 300 miles to a target area, arrive overhead still carrying those tanks, engage enemy fighters with the tanks attached if necessary, dominate the combat due to superior climb and speed, drop the tanks when they ran dry, continue fighting clean, strafe ground targets, then fly 300 miles back to base. Japanese squadrons couldn't match any part of that profile. Their fighters had the range but lacked the power to fight effectively while carrying external fuel. They couldn't dominate combat. They couldn't take punishment and keep flying. They couldn't reliably bring pilots home. The Battle of Okinawa in spring 1945 served as the final demonstration of this imbalance. Okinawa, lying barely 350 miles from mainland Japan, represented the last major stepping stone before an invasion of the home islands. Japan threw everything into its defense, including hundreds of aircraft in mass kamikaze attacks. American carrier groups surrounded the island, providing continuous air cover. Corsairs flew from both carriers and newly captured airfields on Okinawa itself. The slaughter of Japanese aircraft was unprecedented. In a single day, April 6, 1945, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft attacked the invasion fleet. Corsairs and other American fighters destroyed most of them before they reached their targets. The few that got through faced withering anti-aircraft fire. Japanese pilots who survived reported seeing American fighters everywhere, climbing impossibly fast to intercept, diving through formations with impunity, appearing overhead whenever Japanese attack groups formed up. The psychological impact of facing such overwhelming force broke many of Japan's remaining aviators. Some fled back to mainland Japan rather than face certain death. Others went through with kamikaze missions simply because at least that way death would be quick. The slow terror of fighting Corsairs in a zero was worse than a terminal dive into a ship. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the air war was effectively over. Corsairs and other American fighters owned the skies completely. Japan's air force existed only on paper. Most aircraft had been destroyed. Most experienced pilots were dead. Training had collapsed. The home island's air defenses were a hollow shell. Corsairs could have ranged at will over Japan, striking targets anywhere, and there would have been essentially no opposition. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet entry into the war, made that final air campaign unnecessary. But the capability existed entirely because of aircraft like the Corsair. Looking back, the Corsair's ability to climb at 4,000 feet per minute while carrying external drop tanks seems almost mundane compared to modern fighters that can exceed 50,000 feet per minute. But in the context of World War II, this performance was revolutionary. It meant American fighters could deploy anywhere in the Pacific, dominate the airspace, and return safely. Japanese fighters couldn't match this. Their doctrine, their training, their equipment, all became obsolete almost overnight once Corsairs arrived in numbers. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of Japanese pilots died in aircraft they knew were inferior, fighting battles they understood were hopeless. Many were barely trained teenagers sent to die in zeros against American veterans in Corsairs. The outcome was never in doubt. From early 1944 onward, Japanese air power spiraled into terminal decline. The introduction of fighters like the Corsair accelerated that decline into collapse. The Zero, once feared and respected, became just another obsolete design that stayed in service too long because nothing better was available. For American pilots, the Corsair was vindication. After Pearl Harbor, after the dark days of early 1942 when Zeros shot down American aircraft with impunity, the Corsair represented payback. It was faster, tougher, more powerful. It could fight anywhere and win. Pilots loved it, despite its early quirks and carrier landing difficulties. Marines, especially bonded with the bent-wing bird, using it to devastating effect in ground attack missions and air superiority fights alike. The nickname, Whistling Death, came from the sound the aircraft made in high-speed dives, a noise Japanese troops learned to fear. The legacy of the Corsair extended well beyond World War II. It fought in Korea, where it again proved its worth against newer jet fighters and in ground attack roles. It served with numerous foreign air forces for years after the war. Some remained in service until the 1960s. No other American fighter of World War II had such an extended service life. That longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of its design. The combination of power, ruggedness, and versatility meant the Corsair remained relevant long after its contemporaries were retired. But perhaps its greatest legacy was psychological. The Corsair, more than any other single aircraft, demonstrated to Japan that they had lost the technological race. When Japanese pilots saw Corsairs climbing away from them with drop tanks attached, they understood viscerally that America's industrial might couldn't be matched. The same nation that built B-29 Superfortress bombers with pressurized cabins and remote-controlled gun turrets could also build fighters that violated every assumption about aircraft performance. This realization spread beyond just pilots to Japanese military leadership and eventually to the civilian population. The story of the Corsair shocking Japanese Zero pilots with its climb rate isn't just about specifications and performance numbers. It's about how technology, properly applied, can overturn even the most carefully constructed tactical doctrines. Japan had built an entire air warfare system around the Zero's strengths. When the Corsair arrived with capabilities that exceeded Japanese assumptions about what was possible, that system collapsed. The psychological shock of watching American fighters climb at 4,000 feet per minute while carrying external fuel broke something fundamental in Japanese pilots' confidence. Today, restored Corsairs fly at air shows, their distinctive bent wings and roaring R-2000, 800 engines, reminding crowds of an era when American engineering reached new heights under the pressure of total war. The sound they make in a high-speed pass, that whistling howl that gave them their Japanese nickname, still raises goosebumps. These aircraft represent more than just wartime success. They symbolize the combination of industrial capacity, engineering brilliance, and pilot skill that won the Pacific Air War. For the Japanese pilots who faced them, the Corsair represented something else entirely. It was proof that their initial victories were temporary. It showed that America, once fully mobilized, could and would produce weapons that Japan couldn't counter. And most painfully, it demonstrated that the Zero, the fighter they trusted and mastered, had become obsolete. That psychological defeat, watching enemy fighters climb away from you with fuel tanks attached while your own aircraft struggled to keep pace even when clean, may have been worse than the physical defeats in combat. The numbers tell the story coldly. The Corsair achieved a kill ratio of approximately 11-1 against Japanese aircraft. Over 2,100 Japanese planes were shot down by Corsairs, with only 189 Corsairs lost in aerial combat. Thousands more Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. The Corsair flew over 64,000 combat missions during World War II. Its combat record stands as one of the most dominant in aviation history. But behind those numbers were individual moments of shock and terror. Japanese pilots watching in disbelief as Corsairs pulled away in vertical climbs, Zero aviators dying in aircraft that couldn't escape or outfight their pursuers. American pilots growing confident and aggressive as they learned their planes could handle anything. Engineers and factory workers in America churning out better and better versions of the Corsair. The slow, grinding defeat of Japan's Air Force, one engagement at a time, one shocked Japanese pilot at a time. The Corsair wasn't the only American fighter that outperformed the Zero. The Hellcat, the P-38 Lightning, the P-51 Mustang, all contributed to Japan's aerial defeat. But the Corsair, with its distinctive appearance and devastating performance, particularly that ability to climb at 4,000 feet per minute even with drop tanks, became emblematic of American air superiority. It was the fighter Japanese pilots feared most. It was the aircraft that appeared in their nightmares. And it was the plane that, more than any other, proved that Japan's gamble on the Zero had failed. In the end, the story of Japanese Zero pilots, shocked by Corsairs climbing at impossible rates while carrying external fuel, is really the story of how war drives innovation. Japan created a brilliant fighter for the strategic situation of 1941, but they couldn't evolve that design fast enough to keep pace with American progress. The United States, with its vast industrial base and culture of innovation, created not just one response to the Zero, but multiple fighters that each exceeded it in different ways. The Corsair was perhaps the most dramatic example, combining raw power, rugged construction, and tactical versatility in a package that Japanese designers couldn't match. When that Japanese Zero pilot over Rabaul in early 1944 watched a Corsair with drop tanks climb away from him at 4,000 feet per minute, he wasn't just witnessing superior technology. He was watching the future of air combat, a future where power and protection mattered more than lightweight agility, a future where American engineering would dominate, a future where the Zero, and Japan's hopes for air superiority, would become relics of the past. The Corsair proved that with enough power, with enough engineering brilliance, With enough industrial capacity, even the laws of aerial combat could be rewritten. And once Japanese pilots understood that, once they'd seen it with their own eyes and lived through it, or died trying, the air war was effectively over. All that remained was the slow, inevitable collapse of Japanese air power under the weight of American technological and industrial supremacy. The bent-wing bird with its screaming R2800 engine had changed everything, one shocked Japanese pilot at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.